Big Shaq saves a girl in a wheelchair. A single act of courage that ripped through silence and lit the fire of justice. When the world chose to look away, the giant bent down, lifted the broken, and dared to fight what no one else would. One abandoned girl, one unstoppable heart, and a moment that changed both their lives, forever. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. What if the strongest man in town was also the softest? From the outside, Shaq looked like an immovable mountain. He was 65, standing 7 feet tall, his frame still impossibly broad after years away from the basketball courts. His imposing presence naturally commanded attention, even at rest. But if you looked closer, you'd notice the gentleness in his eyes. Eyes seasoned by pain, tempered by kindness, longing to offer comfort where the world had offered none. He lived in a modest brick home, on the quieter side of Atlanta, far from the spotlight. Police cruisers with tinted windows passed by at a respectful distance. University students still recognized him when he walked under oak trees to visit nearby hospitals or schools. But life had simplified for Shaq since his last NBA season. He'd switched out stadium lights for porch lamps, championship rings for the steady rhythm of construction hammers and volunteer efforts. He paid for wheelchair ramps in neighborhoods that needed them. He supplemented school lunch programs. He'd even set up a local scholarship for students of color, aiming to study social work. His reputation had transformed from Big Shaq the superstar to Shaq the man who answered emails from strangers with warmth and punctuality. It began with a small accident in spring, 5 years ago, an overturned wheelchair on a cracked sidewalk near his old mansion. Shaq saw it happen, rushed over, lifted the wheelchair upright, found the girl's address listed on an envelope in the basket, and set up the first ramp. That incident opened something inside him. It brought back memories from his own youth, being a towering black kid in small-town Louisiana, feeling both above and apart. He'd been extraordinary physically, but human connection had often eluded him. He'd grown up seeing classmates nudge each other with rude jokes behind his back, never daring to say them to his face. Fame magnified it. Every misstep was public, every insult magnified, but still, no one ever built a ramp at his house. So he started building them for others. Neighbors recalled how he showed up early one August morning to pour concrete for a ramp leading to old Mr. Whitaker's house. Mr. Whitaker was a wheelchair-bound war veteran. His family couldn't afford accessibility upgrades, and the city wouldn't help. Shaq didn't bother them with media or photographs. He just quietly knocked, introduced himself as Shaq, and got to work. By lunch the ramp was in place, and Mr. Whitaker rolled down it with a huge, grateful smile. That became Shaq's morning cup of purpose. But such charity had its costs. He'd received his share of criticism. A few men muttered about how he's always trying to fix things that aren't broke. Some whispers carried racist undertones, about a black man visiting certain neighborhoods, about how he doesn't belong there. Shaq never retaliated. He rarely responded in public. Instead, he made it his mission to speak in deeds. He found a quiet satisfaction in quiet acts. Inside his home, he led a disciplined life. His days began before 6 a.m., with stretches and strength training. Then came breakfast, oatmeal with fresh berries, lean turkey bacon, and a glass of water. Afterward, he suited up in a white polo, khaki pants, and sturdy boots, headed to construction sites or meeting rooms with local leaders. Despite being worth tens of millions, Shaq chose modest clothing and simple cars, a hybrid SUV, and a used pickup truck for hauling supply. His gold toothbrush didn't shine any brighter than any other. He made time for the elderly and the young. Once a week he'd visit the local rehabilitation hospital, pushing patients in wheelchairs and asking them about their dreams. "What do you miss?" he'd ask an older man, with a mischievous grin. "Slam dunks with LeBron?" And the man would laugh, slipping a caption of actual basketball nostalgia into an afternoon filled with therapeutic monotony. Shaq never corrected the fantasy. He merely played along, running his massive hands along the wheelchair's handles and gripping them as though ready to drive up a court. Each act came with a memory. In college, he had been stopped by police during a jog, told that black men ran in his neighborhood. He had to wait 30 minutes in handcuffs before the officers realized they had the wrong guy. The memory still made him flinch. Years of fame hadn't erased the inherent distrust bred into systems that were supposed to protect. On a redeveloped street, he found his pulse quicken when a patrol car drove by slowly. Again they slowed to stare. He responded with a smile and allowed the silent statement that he had earned every inch of existence in that town. It was a defiant declaration of peace. His philanthropy had also introduced him to systemic weaknesses. One afternoon, he spoke at a high school graduation in southwest Atlanta. There he noticed a pattern. Kids with disabilities, particularly black kids, didn't graduate. Their diplomas were absent from the ceremony. The graduation stage lacked empty chairs. Nobody asked why some students missing meant less applause. He hadn't realized it until then, with scholarships for athletes, performing artists, honor students, but nothing for students who couldn't join paraprofessional programs because the school had no interpreters or accessible seating. Shaq paid for a full accessibility commission and promptly diverted grant money to ensure no child would be left on the bleachers again. Despite the small victories, Shaq's pain never faded. The death of his mother Lucille years ago reopened old wounds that fame had tried to heal. She had been his cornerstone, always reminding him, "You can be strong and gentle." She kept him balanced, grounded in humility, even as the crowds cheered. When she died, the foundation cracked. He went silent for months, distancing himself from charities, fans, and even his own voice. It was around that time he began to spend weekends at the community church in his neighborhood. No grand pulpit speeches, just attendance in the back pew. A place where no one needed to ask who he was. He said 3 words in every service: "Thank you, Lord." Inside he listened. That quiet regiment restored something in him. The reminder that humility doesn't negate power, but tempers it with care. Late last spring, a small controversy erupted when a city planner suggested he should stick to athletics and leave social engineering to activists. Critics said he was meddling beyond his reach. He responded not with a press release or Twitter storm, but by quietly funding 3 elementary schools' accessibility upgrades. No media, no speeches, no confirmation pictures. The ramps went up, the students wheeled in, and reporters noticed too late. The man had already disappeared again. Neighborhood kids whispered stories about the big giant who roamed at dawn, carrying lumber up steep driveways, wiping sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of a white polo. One such kid once grabbed a piece of leftover fabric and made Shaq a makeshift apron. He wore it like a medal, and the kid beamed. That was the paradox of Shaq. He was colossal and unassuming, confrontational in presence but softly spoken in practice. His fists might once have thrown dunks, but now they shaped possibility. The gentle heart beat steadily beneath the muscle, reminding us that true strength allows space for tenderness. And so, the strongest man in town continued, walking Atlanta's streets with giant steps tailored for those less tall, every stride a promise of refuge for those who needed one. Not because he had to, but because he couldn't help it. Because somewhere deep inside he knew what it felt like to stand alone. And this time he wasn't letting anyone else do the same. There was a peaceful rhythm to his mornings, until Lorale's silent silhouette by the laundromat disrupted the beat. The tumble of racism, the hush of unsaid truths, the ache of empathy, all of it was about to collide with Shaq's gentle existence. He didn't know it yet, but he was ready for what came next. Sometimes, you don't find purpose. It finds you in the most broken places. For Shaq it began with a detour, a quiet morning walk rerouted by city maintenance and traffic cones. He turned left down a lane he didn't normally travel, past an aging row of shops with sun-faded signs and cracked pavement. There, nestled between a check-cashing outlet and a shuttered corner bookstore, stood a laundromat whose flickering neon sign read, "Open 24 hours, though it hardly looked alive. Outside that laundromat sat a girl. At first glance, she was just another silent figure among the city's daily tapestry. But as Shaq's shadow fell across the sidewalk, he noticed the wheelchair first. Old but functional, one armrest patched with gray tape. The girl in it looked to be 15, maybe 16, with delicate arms folded across her chest. Her shirt was clean, crisp even, as though someone had gone out of their way to wash and press it, yet her skin was pale beneath the morning sun, and her gaze wasn't fixed on anything in particular. It just hung there in the air, dull and heavy. Shaq slowed his pace. Something about her presence snagged at his gut like a warning bell. Only he could hear. He'd passed hundreds of people on these streets, some down on luck, others hardened by survival. But this girl didn't wear the world's cruelty and scars, or threats. She wore it in silence. The next morning, she was there again. Same chair, same spot, same eyes staring at nothing. And the morning after that, 3 days in a row. The regulars at the barber shop next door barely glanced at her anymore, as if she'd become part of the scenery. But Shaq couldn't accept that. He watched the way customers stepped around her without acknowledgement, how some drivers at the red light wouldn't make eye contact. But he also heard the whispers. They always came in sideways. That's the Miller girl. Real shame. What happened? She doesn't talk. Won't let nobody help. Heard her aunt dropped her off months ago and never came back. I bet the city's too scared to ask questions. Shaq didn't trust gossip. Not in a town where cruelty often wore civility's smile. Still, his instincts told him something wasn't right. He approached one morning with a bag of fresh fruit and a bottle of cold water. As his giant frame lowered beside her, he placed the bag on her lap. "For you," he said gently, expecting nothing in return. She didn't speak. Her eyes slid to the bag briefly, then away, like even the concept of kindness exhausted her. He stayed beside her for a few minutes. No questions, no speeches, just quiet presence. Then he stood, nodded once and walked off. The next day, she was still there. The fruit was gone. It became a silent ritual. Shaq would bring something, a warm blanket, a notebook, once even a small sketch pad, and leave it on her lap. Lorelei, he'd learned from a handwritten name stitched on the inside of her worn backpack, never said thank you, but she didn't roll away either. As days turned to weeks, Shaq's curiosity deepened. Where did she go at night? Who looked after her? Why did no one else seem to notice her vanishing into the margins? He spoke with a few shop owners, but answers were vague. One said she was placed in a foster home outside the county, then just showed up here one day. Another recalled seeing her pushed in a chair by an older woman, who vanished after a loud argument inside the laundromat. The story didn't add up. There were no formal records in child services. No one had filed a missing person report. The school across the street had no enrollment under her name. She existed, but only barely. Shaq started leaving business cards tucked in the pages of the sketchbooks he gave her. On the back he wrote, "If you need me, I'll come." Nothing more. No pressure. No expectation. One afternoon, a local reporter named Callan, someone who'd once covered Shaq's charity work, called him about a rumor. "There's talk about you keeping company with a stray," he said. "A few folks downtown don't like it." Shaq was used to disapproval. But this struck deeper. What kind of place turned kindness into suspicion? What did it say about a community that a man offering help was treated as a threat, while a child in a wheelchair sat abandoned on their doorstep? The next time he approached Lorelei, he noticed something had shifted. Her arms weren't folded. They rested at her sides. Her eyes met his briefly, but deliberately. She didn't smile, but she didn't turn away either. And that, for Shaq, was enough to know he was supposed to stay. He spoke to her, softly, over the weeks. Stories from his own childhood, funny ones mostly, with a touch of sadness he hoped she'd understand. He told her about the first time he was benched because of attitude, when in truth it had been fear from a coach who couldn't handle a kid that big. And that black. He talked about Lucille, his mother, who taught him the difference between hearing and listening. He noticed Lorelei began sketching in the pad he'd given. Fast lines. Angled. Sometimes just shapes. But once, he saw she'd drawn a man tall, wide-shouldered, with kind eyes. Her version of him. One rainy morning, he found her spot empty. Panic bloomed. He walked the entire block 3 times before returning home. That evening he found the sketch pad left on his porch, wrapped in a plastic bag. Inside was a new drawing, her chair beside his parked truck. Below it, written in small, jagged handwriting, "Don't let them take me." The message chilled him. She hadn't told him where she went. But the fear in that sentence revealed everything. Someone was watching her. Someone she didn't trust. Someone the system didn't protect her from. Shaq realized something else then. She wasn't just scared. She was hunted by silence. Not the kind that comes from choosing peace, but the kind forced upon people who've seen too much and been believed too little. He had to find out more, not just because he cared, but because Lorelei had chosen to break her silence for him. That kind of trust, once earned, demanded action, and action was what Big Shaq did best. The dust on Lorelei's wheels wasn't from aimless waiting. It was from forced stillness, from a system that had rolled over her life and left her immobile. But now her story was about to move, and Shaq would be the one to push it forward, even if the road got darker before the light. The louder the town talks, the darker the truth it hides. What began as whispers around laundromats and gas stations started collecting weight, like dust forming into storm clouds. Shaq wasn't just hearing fragments of gossip anymore. He was listening to something deeper, a hum of avoidance. The kind that meant someone didn't want a question answered. Lorelei's presence, once dismissed as background noise, had begun echoing through the town in uncomfortable waves. Shaq began asking questions. He started with the basics, checking with the local high school she should have been attending. He walked in with calm authority, his massive frame filling the narrow front office, and asked for her records. The receptionist gave him a tight smile, typed briefly into her computer, then paused. "I'm sorry, sir. We have no student enrolled under that name." He leaned slightly forward, voice measured. "Check again. First name Lorelei, 15. Probably enrolled sometime last year." She blinked. Then, with just a flicker of hesitation, she said, "There was a Lorelei Williams, but she was withdrawn a while ago." "By who?" The woman's fingers froze. Her smile wavered. "Her legal guardian. I can't say more without authorization." Shaq thanked her and left without pushing. But his gut knew better. Something wasn't right. He visited the county registrar's office next. There things got stranger. The system had her name listed under enrollment for one semester, 9th grade, but then abruptly terminated. No documentation attached. No behavior reports. No disciplinary flags. Just a cold, unexplained exit. Back in his truck, he sat still, the engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel. The town had seen kids fall through cracks before, but this wasn't falling. This was pushing. Later that day, Shaq found an old friend, Reggie, who had worked maintenance at the school district for over 2 decades. Reggie was the type who knew more than he let on. He'd seen how schools operated behind closed doors, especially when it came to kids who were different, or black, or both. "Lorelei?" Reggie asked, voice dropping. "Yeah, I remember her. Rolled in here with a white woman. Older, hard eyes. Didn't say much." "What happened?" Shaq asked. Reggie hesitated. "Something went down in the teacher's lounge. I don't know all the details. Heard it involved the guardian yelling about inappropriate expectations and threatening legal action. Next thing I knew, the girl wasn't coming to school no more. Like she vanished." Shaq leaned back. His mind churned with timelines. A teenage girl in a wheelchair, pulled from school after a confrontation. No follow-up, no re-enrollment, no investigation. It wasn't just neglect. It was intentional. He tried calling the county education board. Emails bounced back with bureaucratic delays. One administrator finally responded, "The matter has been reviewed and closed. Further inquiry could jeopardize ongoing district processes." The sentence read like a veil, thin and deliberate. So he drove to the board office the next morning. He wore no suit, no smile, just denim and boots. His presence still commanded enough respect that the secretary looked immediately uncomfortable. "I'm here to speak with Superintendent Branford," he said. "I'm afraid he's not in." Shaq cut her off gently but firmly. "Tell him I'll wait." An hour later, a short man with graying hair appeared. He offered his hand but didn't meet Shaq's eyes. "Mr. O'Neill, I understand you have concerns, but as I've said before, the case is closed." "No one's answering the real question," Shaq interrupted. "Why was a disabled black student taken out of school, and no one thought to check where she ended up?" Branford's smile faltered. "There are protocols, of course. Parental authority, legal guardianship. These things are not ours to override. We don't want to be accused of overstepping. You understand." "I understand when people hide behind process to avoid doing what's right." The meeting ended with polite evasions, but Shaq's instincts flared hot. This wasn't just administrative coldness. It was avoidance soaked in fear. Over the next week, Shaq tried following the trail. He asked around about Lorelei's guardian. Few remembered her name. Some called her Ms. Dana. Others thought she was a hired nurse. No family, no church, no known job, just a face that appeared and then vanished. Even local law enforcement had no records of guardianship transfer. Meanwhile, Lorelei began appearing at different spots along the same stretch of town. Not just outside the laundromat anymore, but behind the diner, outside the public library, even once near a drainage tunnel. Always alone. Always silent. Shaq tried approaching, but she'd roll away if he asked too many questions. Her fear wasn't random. It was learned, rehearsed. One evening, while scanning archived news bulletins, Shaq stumbled upon a small blurb from 7 months ago. A city council meeting had included a proposal to revise inclusion programs for students with mobility needs. It was struck down after an anonymous complaint about misuse of state funds. No names, no follow-up. But then he noticed something else. The same month the complaint was filed, 2 local families had reported missing accessibility equipment from their school campuses. Lifts, specialized seats, ramp installations, equipment Lorelei might have used. Nothing was stolen. It had been reassigned. The deeper he dug, the worse it got. Every time he asked about Lorelei, resistance followed. People got nervous, some changed the subject. Others avoided his calls. A janitor from the high school called him anonymously one night. They said she was too much trouble, too many expenses, said they'd figure out a way to redirect her needs. Like she was an inconvenience, not a child. Shaq sat in his living room that night, lights off, listening to the clock tick. The whispers weren't just noise, they were warnings. The town had something to hide, and someone was making sure it stayed buried. Lorelei, in her silence, had been screaming this entire time. And now Shaq was listening. Truth doesn't scream. It arrives in ashes. It was just past 6 a.m. when Shaq opened his front door and found the envelope. The morning air was sharp, the light still orange from a waking sun. A single manila envelope sat at the foot of his porch, edges curled from heat, its corners singed black. He crouched slowly, the weight in his knees forgotten. As he picked it up, the burn was deliberate, not full destruction, but a warning. He opened it carefully, unfolding the charred flap. Inside, a single photograph fell into his hand. It was Lorelei, taken from a low angle, probably without her knowing. She sat in her wheelchair outside the old laundromat, her eyes hollow. What made Shaq's breath catch wasn't the framing, it was the marks. Faint bruises along her left temple, a discolored patch beneath her collarbone, and what looked like a healing burn on her arm. Behind the photo, a small note typed in all caps, held only 5 words. Some things are better hidden. He stood there for a moment, unmoving, the weight of the message anchoring him. Whoever had delivered this didn't want to scare him. They wanted to warn him. But even more, they wanted him to stop digging. It was the message of someone who'd burned bridges before. Someone who knew how fear worked in silence. But they didn't know Shaq. He didn't panic. He didn't call the police. Not yet. He walked inside, turned on the coffee machine, and laid the envelope flat on the kitchen table. His fingers hovered over the photo again. His anger rose like heat from a stove. Not loud, not wild, just steady. By midday he'd called in 3 favors, none of them small. First he phoned Malcolm Green, a civil rights attorney he'd met during a police reform fundraiser 2 years ago. Green was sharp, composed, and driven by quiet rage at injustice. But even Malcolm hesitated when Shaq described the envelope. "You need to be careful," Malcolm said. "If this is what it sounds like, you're not dealing with ignorance. You're dealing with people who know the law well enough to bend it. Which is why I need you," Shaq replied. Next he contacted Kendra Blythe, a journalist with a reputation for digging into institutional corruption. She had once exposed a foster care fraud ring in Missouri that brought down a state official. She answered on the 3rd ring, curious as ever. "You have documents?" she asked. "Just a photo and a threat." She paused. "That's enough. But I'll need more." Shaq agreed to meet her in 2 days. Still, a strange chill ran through him, all night. Not fear, not doubt, but clarity, the kind that comes when you realize the enemy isn't ignorance or mistake, but intention. Someone had hurt Lorelei, and someone else had made sure no one would do anything about it. The next day, he returned to Lorelei's usual spot. She was there, but something was different. Her hoodie was pulled lower than usual, and she avoided eye contact. Shaq crouched beside her, his voice low. "Who took the picture?" She didn't answer, but she did slide her hand slowly toward the edge of her backpack, as if reaching for something. Then she stopped, hesitated, and pulled back. He didn't press. He just stood, told her he'd be nearby, and walked to his truck. That afternoon, Malcolm called back. "I ran her name through state systems. There's a sealed record. That's not normal. Usually that only happens in high-risk foster transfers or protection cases. Someone's covering tracks. Can you get it unsealed?" "I can try. But it'll raise flags." Shaq leaned on his kitchen counter, mind racing. "Let them wave." The following morning, the mailbox held another envelope. This one wasn't burned, But inside was a red folder. No note. Just a printout of a medical evaluation. Lorelei's, judging by the name and birth date. It detailed injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. The doctor's notes were brief and hesitant. Inconsistent explanation given by guardian. No follow-up permitted by adult present. Shaq stared at the paper for a long time. That night, Kendra met him at a quiet cafe off Peachtree. She brought a laptop, voice recorder, and fire in her eyes. He handed her the medical report and photo. She read silently for several minutes. "I'll dig," she said finally. "But if this leads where I think it does, you need to be ready. These people don't back off. They erase." Shaq nodded. "I'm not looking to play hero. I just want her safe." The tension in the air thickened over the next few days. At night he noticed unfamiliar cars slowing near his house. His security cameras flickered. Emails arrived late or didn't send at all. Malcolm confirmed that someone had tried accessing sealed juvenile court documents using his credentials. They'd failed. But the attempt was enough to trigger an internal audit. "They're watching," Malcolm said. "And they're nervous." Lorelei didn't appear at her spot for 3 days. Shaq checked every corner she might have retreated to. No sign. The tension coiled tighter. He visited the local hospital, the shelters, even the bus station. No one had seen her. Then, just as he considered contacting media directly, he received a new text from an unlisted number. It read, "Back off. Last warning." He responded with a single image, the photo of Lorelei's bruised face.
No reply.
That night, he sat in his truck, engine off, across from the laundromat. Around 10 p.m., Lorelei wheeled herself silently out of the alley behind it. He got out, walked across the street slowly, hands open.
"Are you okay?"
She looked up, then down. No words. "Was it the same person?" he asked. Still silence. But she nodded once. Shaq crouched low. "I can protect you, but I need your help. Even just a name." She reached into her hoodie, pulled out a folded receipt. On the back was a name, Marlon Cutter. Shaq blinked. He knew that name. Cutter was on the city's economic board, responsible for educational grants, foster resource allocations, and coincidentally, had recently spearheaded a campaign to streamline troubled youth transitions. Cutter wasn't a ghost. He was the system. That night, Shaq didn't sleep. He made copies of everything, sent encrypted files to Malcolm and Kendra. Then he called a meeting, with city council reps, advocacy lawyers, and anyone with power who wasn't bought. Because truth had arrived. Not with sirens, not with shouts, but with a burned envelope, and a girl who trusted him enough to whisper it. When doors close in daylight, justice walks alone at night. Shaq had never imagined that his strength, the same that had carried him through championship games, through arenas of tens of thousands, would mean nothing here, against walls built from bureaucratic silence and shadows too disciplined to leave a trail. The photo, the bruises, the sealed records, even the name Marlon Cutter. It should have been enough to ignite action. But instead, each door he knocked on closed a little faster. Each call grew colder. Each email met with a new layer of red tape. The school board, when pressed again, simply repeated the script they'd rehearsed. Ms. Williams was voluntarily withdrawn from the district by her legal guardian, Ms. Dana Wexler, 6 months prior. No evidence of wrongdoing on school grounds. No action warranted. The note read like an automated apology without an ounce of heart. Shaq pointed out the inconsistencies. How Lorelei had remained in town, visibly unsupervised, clearly neglected, but the officials just nodded mechanically. They refused to acknowledge the photograph. They refused to confirm if Marlon Cutter had any involvement in the guardian placement process. When Malcolm tried to push further with subpoenas, the clerk's office stalled. The judge assigned to their filing recused himself without explanation. A replacement judge was assigned, but she immediately sealed the request pending further documentation. Nothing moved forward. Kendra, who'd once exposed entire state departments, hit a wall harder than either of them expected. "Sources are going silent," she told Shaq on a tense call. "I had 2 people inside child services willing to talk. Both just backed out. One literally texted me, 'Not safe. Don't call again.'" She paused. "And I've seen this before. It's not just corruption, it's layers. Like someone with real power is coordinating silence." Shaq felt the grip of helplessness tightening. Still, he kept going, calling radio stations, leaving anonymous tips, sending copies of Lorelei's medical record to advocacy groups, even trying to approach state officials at a fundraiser. But one by one, the conversations shifted. Polite dismissals, nervous smiles. A councilwoman pulled him aside and said, "Shaq, I know your heart's in the right place, but this isn't your fight. Let it go, for your safety." His safety? He'd spent years in a league that profited from his body, from his image, while offering silence when racial slurs were hurled at him on road games. He'd been told not to be political when he asked why certain schools in black neighborhoods had no working elevators. He'd stood tall through it all. But now, standing up for a child who had nothing, they told him to stop. Meanwhile, the whispers about him grew bolder. In barbershops, they asked why a rich man was so obsessed with a girl he barely knew. In churches, they wondered aloud if he was being used. A thin thread of suggestion unraveled into suspicion. Why is he always with that girl? Isn't she too young to be around a man like that without family? No accusations. Just enough poison in the phrasing to spread. The story began to turn. Media outlets stopped returning Kendra's calls. A well-known podcast that initially agreed to feature the case suddenly postponed indefinitely. One morning, Shaq woke up to find spray-painted words on his mailbox. "She's not yours to save." And then Lorale disappeared. 3 days. No sign. Her spot outside the laundromat sat empty, the concrete stained where her wheels once rested. He drove street after street, his truck clocking in silent, looping circuits across town. He checked shelters, questioned vendors, walked alleyways, left messages. Nothing. He considered going public himself, posting the photo, naming names, demanding accountability. But Malcolm warned him, if they spin this as defamation without clear protection, they'll sue you into silence. Or worse, they'll discredit you permanently. The fear wasn't just for his name. It was for Lorelei. If she had been taken again, moved, hidden, hurt, every moment wasted felt like a wound. Shaq couldn't heal. And then, as the fourth day loomed near dusk, a package appeared on his doorstep. No envelope. Just a small brown box, hand-wrapped in twine. Inside, a folded blue scarf. Lorelei's. He recognized it immediately from the sketch she once left behind, where she'd drawn herself in that scarf beside his truck. Beneath it, a note in handwriting that wasn't hers. "She's somewhere safer now. This ends here." It was both a statement and a sentence. They weren't threatening anymore. They were declaring victory. Shaq sat down in the doorway, holding the scarf between both palms. He couldn't cry, not because he didn't want to, but because something inside him had gone too still. This wasn't just about Lorelei anymore. It wasn't even about Marlon Cutter or a single corrupt system. It was about a whole town built around what it could look away from, and how easy it was to call silence justice. He called Malcolm. "We're not asking anymore," Shaq said, voice low. "We're taking this story out of their hands." Malcolm hesitated. "You know what that means, right?" "I do, and I'm ready. Because justice, when denied at the front door, always finds its way in through the cracks." Shaq just had to break something open. The silence of a child can be louder than a crowd's rage. For Shaq, the ache began in the hollow gloom of a storm-drained tunnel behind the laundromat, where dark water once collected only rain, but now harbored Lorelei's shattered spirit. He found her in the afternoon light, just as the sun began to angle toward dusk. The tunnel entrance was low, nearly hidden behind a sheet metal door that sagged. He had followed a fragment of hope, and there she was, curled inside like a small animal in need of shelter. Soaked from a leaking pipe overhead, her wheelchair abandoned just outside the mouth of the drain. Shaq knelt beside her. He could see her trembling. Rainwater dripped onto the pavement, blending with the tears that streaked her face. Her clothes were sodden, clinging to her limbs as though afraid to fall away. The room was silent, save for the hiss of distant traffic and her faint, frightened sobs. Shaq gently shook her shoulder, whispering, "It's okay, I've got you." He didn't rush to stand her up or ask questions. He just sat and held his quiet watchfulness. When she finally looked up, her eyes were distant, ghostly. Each blink let in new details: a bruise along her jaw, a fresh tear frozen halfway down her cheek, damp strands of hair plastered to her forehead. She tried to speak, but only one raspy whisper emerged. He said, and then she froze, fear overtaking her voice. Shaq took off his jacket and wrapped it around her. He pressed it softly over her shoulders, feeling the shudder beneath. Then he pulled his cell phone from his pocket, hit the flashlight, and shone it along the ceiling. Dripping water, rusted bolts, a cavernous enough space to echo even the tiniest sound. He knew there was no time, so he scooped her into his arms, climbed out of the tunnel, and carried her to his truck. When she was safely buckled inside, he drove with deliberate speed to the hospital, ignoring all the internal warnings about media or police involvement. Trauma was real, and silence wasn't protection, it was prison. At the emergency intake, she was hushed through exams and tests. She never cried, didn't speak. Instead, she stared, like she was auditing a script she didn't want to remember. Shaq stayed close, silent sentinel, until the doctor confirmed her physical injuries were worsening, not critical, but requiring monitoring. Emotional trauma, they said, would have to be assessed later. Because Lorelei couldn't, or wouldn't talk, they kept her overnight. Shaq didn't sleep. He paced halls, called Malcolm and Kendra, and coordinated with a child advocacy hotline. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, he felt the walls tilt, realized that no matter how many resources he could bring, none of them were enough, unless Lorelei found her voice again. By the third morning, Lorelei was drained, her resilience etched in sharp hollows beneath her eyes. Then during a lull, when the doctor stepped out, Shaq sat next to her bed and spoke. "Do you remember anything?" His voice was gentle. "Just a name, a place, a feeling." He reached out, careful, and placed his hand over hers. She looked at him for a long time. Then she closed her eyes and said, with the weight of absolute fear, "It's not just him. It's all of them." He nodded slowly, allowing her silence to stretch until she dared to continue. "They're not hiding in dark rooms." Her voice was firmer now, though still soft. "They're in the chamber meetings, and the grant committees, and the foster board. They decide who belongs and who doesn't." Shaq's heart sank. This wasn't a rogue guardian or a lone abuser. This was systemic. Embedded power with eyes that didn't blink, mouths that didn't speak, and hearts that didn't care. "They made me disappear," she said. "They moved me around until I quit asking questions. I tried to tell my papers, my school. No one would listen. They said it was in my guardian's hands. They said I was fine until I wasn't." He tightened his hold on her hand. "Those men, they did that?" She closed her eyes and nodded. "Marlon Cutter isn't alone. There's a council of them. Finance board, school board, social services. They met in hidden rooms, talked numbers. Children were line items. My wheelchair, my therapy, my future, all expenses." With measured calm, she continued. "Ms. Wexler, my guardian, was one of them. She'd bring me to meetings with Cutter. I thought I was special. Then I learned why they brought me. They needed someone to test the programs, the cuts, the shortfalls, someone they could write off." Her words were precise. "Dangerous." "When I complained, Cutter said it wasn't about me. It was about community budgets. He said black kids with disabilities cost too much. He said they weren't my people. They were disposable." Shaq's fury burned underneath control. No physical movement, just the crushing pressure of love and outrage. Justice, he realized, was no longer about policies. It was about dismantling shadows. These men had hidden behind meetings and paperwork, hiding their contempt in spreadsheets. They weren't monsters wearing masks. They were calculators dressed as leaders. He squeezed her hand. "You were never disposable. You were brave." He straightened in his chair and kept his voice quiet, but strong. "We're going to shine light on all of them." Lorelei met his gaze. There was relief, but also hesitation. "If I say it, then they'll know whose voice it was." Shaq studied the pale light in the room, thought about the burned envelope, the bribed silence spreading through the town, and the hollow echo of whispers. "We'll protect you," he said. "Lawyers, witnesses, journalists, I promise I won't let them hurt you again." Her eyes flinched with renewed fear, and maybe hope. Outside the room, the world still waited in darkness. Inside, a child in a wheelchair, trembling but resolute, was ready to stand. They both knew the next step would be harder, choosing light over shadows. But for 3 days, her silence had not defeated them. It had prepared them. That night, Lorelei spoke into a recorder. Shaq had set near her pillow, a quiet recounting of each meeting room, each face, each phrase, expenses, community budget, disposable. She ended with one sentence, clear and firm: "I am not disposable." When she pressed stop, Shaq exhaled. And somewhere in the world outside, a wave began to build, a whisper turning into a roar. In the darkest corners, the unheard start to sing. What began as one girl's gasp for survival soon became a chorus of hushed voices, each carrying its own weight of neglect and injustice. Shaq, buoyed by Lorelei's courage, realized her was not an isolated case. It was a symptom of something far deeper. He needed allies and voices. That is how Cornell James re-entered his world. Cornell had been Shaq's roommate during his earliest basketball years at LSU, a soft-spoken philosophy major who later became a civil rights attorney. When Shaq reached out, Cornell's voice crackled with just enough hope. "I remember the old city battles. We can do it again." They met late one evening in a second-floor office, overlooking Main Street's neon haze. The scent of coffee and old paper filled the air, encouraging quiet revelations. Cornell brought with him a woman named Evelyn Torres, a former foster care advocate who'd resigned in protest years earlier when funding cuts were signed into law by politicians connected to Marlon Cutter. Evelyn had a ledger of cases: children with disabilities abruptly transferred, withdrawn or left off enrollment after critical seasons of care. No public records, no oversight hearings, just blank spaces where names should be. She described how once she'd confronted a district director about the disappearance of a blind student. The reply was chilling: "We don't lose kids, we relocate risks." Shaq, Cornell, Evelyn, and Kendra, a quiet but determined cohort, knew they needed more. They reached out to teachers who had vanished from their classrooms, janitors who noticed vanishing names from roll call lists, cafeteria staff who remembered children who stopped showing up for meals. One young teacher, Ms. Harriet Cohen, recounted how she woke one morning to find Lorelei's name erased from the digital attendance sheet. "It was like she never existed," Harriet said. "I asked the principal. He smiled and said, 'We're making space for new priorities.'" Cornell organized the evidence clandestinely: digital screenshots, photos of erased files, copies of email threads. They recorded sworn affidavits. Evelyn brought redacted meeting minutes, suggesting discussions about budget realignment and cost efficiency, phrases that disguised contempt for children labeled as burdens. Still, the evidence sat hidden, too small to demand national attention, too dangerous to leave in the open. As their group grew, so did the stakes. On one raw morning, a janitor named Carlos Mendoza met them in a parking garage behind the school district offices. His hands shook as he held a USB drive. Inside were surveillance clips showing Marlon Cutter, the superintendent, and others entering accessible supply closets late at night, carry carts filled with medical supplies, broken equipment bound for donation to other more accountable schools. When pressed about inventory, Cutter had told district employees, "It's reallocation, we can't waste it on dead weight." Shaq felt anger clench his chest, but he channeled it. They cataloged the footage, time-stamped the logs, and had witnesses ready to testify. Cornell pressed local labs to check metadata dates, ensuring the video hadn't been altered. Evelyn cross-referenced names against insurance billing data, showing that many of the removed children had never been medically assessed. The pieces fit together, painting a disturbing mosaic: a systemic removal of vulnerable children for financial gain. Meanwhile, Lorelei, hidden in Shaq's carefully curated protective bubble, began to change. She opened her mouth for the first public retelling of her story. Not in court, but in a safe circle meeting in Shaq's garage at midnight. A small group of allies, advocates, friends, even one sympathetic school counselor gathered. Shaq stood near the doorway, giant and silent as Lorelei, wheelchair in place, laid out her truth. She spoke of hidden meetings, of being introduced as a line item at tables of power, of numbers whispered across conference room tables, as if they were currency more meaningful than a child's future. When she finished, the room remained hushed. Then came the quiet buzz of agreement. It wasn't applause, but something deeper: acknowledgement. Across town, Kendra released a carefully timed expose. She titled it "The Disposable Children: Atlanta's Hidden Betrayal." The article laid bare the pieces they'd gathered: screenshots, videos, witness statements. It focused on a statistical pattern: the abrupt drop in disabled Black and brown youth enrollment across multiple schools. It named names: Marlon Cutter, Superintendent Branford, and the others who'd benefited. Above all, it centered Lorelei's words, letting her speak directly to readers. "I was not a case number," she wrote. "I was a child." The effect was immediate. Local media picked it up. State watchers tuned in. Parents of missing kids emerged from silence, confirming they'd been told their children were transferred or homeschooled, but found no records of that. A group of families formed a coalition, requesting public hearings and demanding the release of school and social services data. An online petition gained tens of thousands of signatures. The whisperings of Shaq's project turned into conversations about community responsibility. The underground choir began to echo across every radio station, every front page, every kitchen table. Of course there were pushbacks. Cutter issued a statement claiming budgetary mismanagement was to blame, and no child had ever been harmed. Branford appeared on a morning talk show, tearful and seemingly repentant, but offering no apologies, only promises of abstract reforms that repeated phrases like moving forward together. The school district's board scheduled closed-door sessions, but the momentum had shifted. They could no longer speak in private halls. Shaq, Cornell, Evelyn, and Kendra prepared for a bigger moment. A forum at City Hall where families would present alongside them, where the media would watch, and the public would decide which voices they believed, the chorused voices of the hidden, or the polished words of power. That night, as they gathered around Cornell's kitchen table, photographs, affidavits, transcripts spread before them. Shaq thought of his mother, Lucille, in her quiet wisdom. She had taught him to use his platform, not for noise, but for substance. He remembered how she said, "Let your silence carry weight." He realized their fight had taken them to those darkest corners, but it was exactly where change began. When the unheard start to sing, even the walls built by wealth and influence tremble. And so, as the first light of dawn crept through curtained windows, the underground choir stayed strong, harmonizing with purpose, ready to be heard. They tried to erase them. Instead, they marched. Shaq stood at the edge of the city block, watching the quiet hum. Before the storm, an unlikely storm of wooden wheels, plastic frames, and unbreakable resolve. Behind him, hundreds of children sat in wheelchairs along the sidewalk, flanked by parents, advocates, and local volunteers. The energy was calm, but deliberate. There was no chant yet, only the sound of wheels brushing concrete, wheels whispering that they could no longer be ignored. He wore a simple gray blazer over a white shirt, no crowd-topping star, no celebrity persona, just one man with a cause. He stepped to the front and surveyed the crowd. Among the faces he saw his old friend Evelyn holding a weathered sign that read, "Access is our right." Cornell carried a megaphone clipped to his belt. Kendra was setting up a live stream feed, flyers in hand. Volunteers passed out water bottles and schedules. The route had been approved. Insurance, permits, coordination with a sympathetic deputy who promised no interference. Yet the tension in the air felt electric, like a tip-off night where everything balances on a moment. As the clock approached noon, Shaq raised his hand. The crowd stilled. With a nod, he started rolling forward, leading the march down Peachtree Avenue. Their method was simple: roll together, stay peaceful, and make sure the world saw them. At first, onlookers stopped to stare. Some smiled, some cried. Others glanced away, embarrassed into attention. Cameras caught the procession from every angle. The sea of children framed in wheelchairs, mothers with eyes firm in determination, fathers whispering encouragement, advocates capturing every moment. Halfway through the march, at the intersection near City Hall, trouble surfaced. An assistant city official stepped out of the front doors, waving a clipboard. "This protest is unapproved. You must turn back." Shaq stopped the march. He rolled forward and spoke softly, but firmly. "This is approved. We have permits." Children didn't break the law when they were broken by the system. His voice carried through the microphone and rustled through the crowd. The official hesitated, confusion flickering across her face. A news crew flashed from the corner, capturing every moment. Children stopped rolling. Parents tightened their grips. The official backed away. The march resumed, more determined than before. They reached the main square, where steps spilled down to a small stage set up by the organizers. Shaq moved up and introduced several speakers, parents who spoke of weeks of waiting for IRS checks, therapists canceled without explanation, young siblings homeschooled because the public system couldn't accommodate them. Each story layered the picture, but something still hung in the air. It needed that spark, that voice to make it real again. Then came Jada Ellis, a 13-year-old girl, with a bright smile hidden behind round glasses and long braids. She wheeled to the front. Her sign, carried by her mother, read, "My voice matters." Jada paused, then looked out across the crowd and cameras. Her voice trembled at first, but she held strong. "I went to this school for 3 years before they said I needed different classes," she said. "But those classes never came. My wheelchair sat in the hall, and I sat at home. I stopped getting better. I forgot what counting looked like. I forgot what words sounded like. I forgot that I mattered." Her words landed with the weight of truth. "They saw me as a number. They saw me as expensive. I am more than that. Her voice grew stronger. I am a person. I am a student. I am a voice. Shaq watched her. He felt something inside shift and lift. This wasn't just protest. It was a narrative shift. It was no longer Shaq's rally. It was their story. From broken wheels came testimonies of broken systems and of rebirth under pressure. Kendra's phone vibrated. She looked down, face lighting up. Live national broadcast, she whispered. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen updated. Within minutes, tweets with broken wheels began trending. National outlets began streaming the march live. Viewers across the country saw Jada, saw the hundreds of children, and saw Shaq standing with them, not above but beside. Back in Atlanta's city offices, officials panicked. Permit denial rumors swirled, lawsuits threatened, and opposition groups whispered backlash. Yet public support only grew. A state senator contacted Shaq, offering to table an emergency hearing. Community leaders pledged to secure grants for equipment. Donors, local and national, started pledging funds for accessibility upgrades. That evening, on national television, cameras captured Jada's speech. Her mother appeared by her side, tears in her eyes. Commentators spoke of a systemic failure, not just in Atlanta, but nationwide. Disability rights organizations scheduled interviews. The march became more than a local demonstration. It was a movement, a demand for structural accountability. That night, after the crowds dispersed, Shaq sat alone on the edge of the stage, guitar strings of empty chairs stretching behind him. Jada came over quietly. Hand in his, he offered her a small smile. She nodded, and he squeezed her shoulder. A week later, the town held a press conference. Jada and Lorelei both appeared, their wheelchairs side by side, their presence a testament to persistence. State officials announced an investigation into the board's practices. New accessibility legislation was drafted. Grants were fast-tracked. No flashy heroics, just systemic change born from grassroots power. And at the center of it all was a parade of broken wheels, made whole by movement, by voices rising in unison, by one man who wouldn't let them be erased. Every hero has limits, until someone breaks them. Just when the movement for Lorelei and others seemed unstoppable, shadows crept back in. Shaq's massive heart was pulled into a storm of lies and suspicion, the kind that felt like betrayal in daylight. It began with a single post on a regional gossip site. Under the guise of community concern, an anonymous tip claimed Shaq had been seen alone with Lorelei in a private location, implying inappropriate behavior. The insinuation was subtle enough to avoid legal liability, yet inflammatory enough to ignite outrage. Social media lit up within hours. Suddenly, hashtags accusing him of grooming trended locally. Two sponsors, ones he'd worked with quietly for years, released statements distancing themselves. One charity paused funding, opting for silence over defense. Shaq knew what this was. The very forces that had sent the burned envelope, erased Lorelei's records, and hidden broken equipment. They had struck again. This time they turned the narrative, feeding it through reporters searching for a scandal easier than the truth. Kendra called first. Her voice trembled with frustration. "Don't respond yet," she urged. "If we pull the storm down, we let them direct the chaos." Malcolm echoed it. "Stay calm. The law is on our side, but headlines move faster than evidence." Still, calm can only hold for so long. Police knocked on Shaq's door 2 days later, bulletins in hand. An officer asked questions. Not accusations, technically, just context. But his tone communicated the intent. Make this difficult enough that even Shaq might retreat. In public view, Shaq remained a picture of composure. Measured Instagram messages about justice, tweets focusing on the movement, not himself. But behind closed doors, supporters wavered. A few volunteers canceled. Parents of children in wheelchairs whispered doubts. They thanked him, but they backed away. Lorelei watched this unfold with fear. She had stood on the stage, voiced her truth. Now the system was weaponizing it. She returned to Shaq's safe house one evening, tears in her eyes, and said quietly, "I can't help if they use me again." Without waiting, she packed a small bag, wheeled herself out a back door, and disappeared. No message. No goodbye. Just silence. The movement staggered. Without her voice, Jada's testimony still echoed, but Lorelei's absence carved a hollow center. News outlets printed slow bleed reports of the scandal while glossing over the underlying story of abuse and neglect. The narrative had flipped. Big Shaq was no longer a protector, but a predator in the minds of too many. Shaq, exhausted, sat in the darkened living room. The weight of the halo he'd worn all these years now fractured. Muttered questions rose in his mind. How many times can you be mistaken for the villain when you're just trying to be human? How do you protect yourself when your every move is weaponized? Then Cornell arrived late one night. He stepped into the room, crates of documents in hand. They're burying her, Cornell said. They need fresh allegations before our evidence surfaces. If we don't act fast, this becomes their final word. They built a plan. A live televised Q&A session. Shaq, Malcolm, Cornell, and Jada. Where the allegations could be confronted directly. They coordinated with national media outlets, disability justice advocates, and state legislators. A press release went out announcing the session at a community center. Open to all. Streamed nationwide. Meanwhile, Kendra went digging. She scoured databases for the original post source. She interviewed former sponsors for context. She tracked down 2 whistleblower employees from Cutter's team, one of whom confirmed the allegations were fabricated in real time by someone high up trying to neutralize press momentum. On the morning of the session, the community center was packed. Cameras, reporters, supporters, parents, all there. Shaq wore no suit, no polished star persona, just a buttoned shirt, rolled up sleeves, and visible vulnerability. Jada sat beside him in her wheelchair. Her presence was a quiet assurance. No Lorelei, but Lorelei's justice lived on. The Q&A began with tough questions. Are you grooming this teenager? What about allegations? Shaq took them calmly, acknowledging the pain of the accusations, then pivoting to the evidence. Sealed court documents, medical reports, whistleblower testimonials, footage showing Lorelei at home with a legitimate guardian, school disappearances, financial records. Over an hour, the narrative shifted visibly. The audience softened. The tone changed. Journalists leaned in. When the session ended, Jada wheeled forward and closed it by saying, "I believe him." Her voice was strong, her statement simple, but it carried the weight of the movement. Whispered apologies from journalists followed. Editors canceled the scandalous op-eds they'd considered. One sponsor asked for reinstatement. Requests to lead accessibility tours began to reappear on Shaq's calendar. But Lorelei was still gone. She had chosen silence again, this time to shelter her spirit and protect Shaq. The team set out to find her, contacting foster networks, reaching out to trusted families, using encrypted messaging. When they finally located her safe house outside of town, remote and protected, they approached delicately. Lorelei agreed to listen, to reconnect, to help rebuild trust through testimony, and this time it would be on her terms. That evening, Shaq stood at the doorway of that safe house. As Lorelei rolled into the light, she met his eyes. No words passed, but years of pain and hope passed between them. He reached out gently, placed his hand on hers, and together they stood facing a fractured halo, no longer unblemished but stronger for its cracks. Justice had slipped, twisted in the hands of those who feared truth. But Shaq and Lorelei were ready to shine light through that crack, proving that every hero can bend, but not break. Sometimes, saving someone means letting them save you back. The letter arrived on an otherwise ordinary Thursday morning. Shaq was reviewing notes for the upcoming state hearing, listening for files, preparing statements, when his assistant knocked, carrying a crisp white envelope, with unfamiliar handwriting, looping across the front. Lorelei Williams. Shaq's heart constricted in hope and fear, as he recognized her name. He sliced the envelope open, with deliberate calm, and unfolded the letter. Inside, flowing script, detailed the months of truth she'd borne alone, and the sorrow she'd carried under pressure he'd barely allowed himself to imagine. She began with gratitude. "Thank you for seeing me, for trusting me, for telling me I mattered." Then she pulled him back into the shadows he'd helped her emerge from. The hush of meetings where children had been reassigned. The hush of budget reviews where her wheelchair was just a line item. The hush of staff rooms where they said, "No one will notice if she's gone." She named names: Marlon Cutter, Superintendent Branford, Dana Wexler, and described meetings he'd never known about, where decisions were made to erase children like hers. She included dates, times, specific phrases. It was an indictment, and a lifeline. Shaq read the letter calm, but felt the tremor beneath his ribs. This was more than a note. It was evidence. He called Cornell, who drove over within the hour. They met in the den, chairs angled toward each other in urgency. Cornell read bits aloud, pausing at phrases like filed under confidential, released only to the board, dispose of liability. He nodded gravely. This is what we've been looking for. Lorelei gave it to us on her terms. They brought Kendra into the circle. She confirmed she had safe contacts at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and a whistleblower at the FBI. With the letter, cameras, recordings, and documented distress, their case could no longer be dismissed as rumor or protest. It demanded action. By the next morning, agents moved in. The FBI quietly secured search warrants. State investigators unsealed documents. The inspection of school district servers revealed deleted attendance records and financial logs showing equipment diverted under maintenance redistribution. The historic hush of privilege was cracking open. Word spread through the town like wildfire. At first, the elite clung together. Cutter's office released a statement calling the allegations unsubstantiated and politically motivated. Branford issued a non-apology apology. Our hearts go out to those affected. We will cooperate fully. But the tone had shifted. Desperation was leaking into their carefully crafted denials. State officials scheduled an emergency hearing. The school board faced subpoenas. Parents of missing children, emboldened, stepped forward. One mother testified her son had been told he must switch schools due to board budget cuts, then simply vanished from the district's system. No transfer paperwork, no standard protocol. Another father confirmed therapists had disappeared from their accessible education plan, without warning, then been replaced by generic IEP language, leaving his daughter without support. Meanwhile, on TV screens across Georgia, Kendra appeared, holding Lorelei's letter and explaining how it sparked the federal inquiry. The crew interviewed parents clutching handwritten affidavits. Advocates stood behind them, fists quietly raised. The public, long unaware, watched as privilege unraveled behind corporate doors. As the hearing began, Shaq and Cornell stood in an audience filled with families, journalists and local leaders. Cutter appeared looking gaunt, flanked by lawyers. Branford sat alone on the board side, legal pads in front of him. Dana Wexler, sharp-suited and pale, watched perceptibly, her eyes refusing to meet Shaq's when the letter was read aloud in evidence. The clerk read Lorelei's words, delivered through Kendra's translation, for all to hear. Citizens wept quietly. Children stared. A hush so heavy fell across the chamber that you could hear muffled sobs, even from the judge's bench. Then came questions. Did Dana Wexler coerce children into waiver agreements? Were funds reallocated from special needs programs? Who ordered the removal of medical equipment? Every question dug at the foundation of their authority. Every answer faltered under the weight of documentation. By midday, several board members resigned. Cutter was placed on administrative leave, pending grand jury review. Branford was removed from all policy committees. Investigations by the Inspector General began into foster care division irregularities. Dana Wexler found herself under scrutiny for guardianship misconduct and potential financial misappropriation. Outside the courthouse, Shaq stepped down to meet media questions. He didn't pose. He didn't posture. He handed microphones to parents ready with their own testimonies, then stepped back. The heroes that afternoon were wheelchairs, whispered revelations, and a child who had chosen to share her truth. Strangers reached out. Donations poured into the Shaq Foundation, earmarked for accessible education. Politicians fast-tracked the Disabled Children's Protection Act. At the state level, nonprofits organized curriculum for inclusion training across the county's districts. A small seed planted in the shadows had sprouted into roots strong enough to hold justice. That evening, after hearings ended, Shaq returned to the safe house, where Lorelei had rewritten her own story. He opened his door to find her waiting. She held a book. Her book, she whispered, a notebook filled with hers and others' stories. They sat together at the kitchen table. He handed her the letter back. You saved us, he said softly. Tears glistened in her eyes. He knew the months of fear and courage it had taken for her to let go of her silence again. She nodded. We did it, she replied, her voice steady. He pulled her into a hug, careful of the brace in the chair, and whispered, together. Justice that evening wasn't a landmark or a proclamation. It was quiet, deeply human, and rooted in the courage of a little girl whose voice refused to be silenced. And sometimes Shaq realized, saving the world meant simply accepting the light someone else offered. This letter from the sky became the first true sunrise in a town, finally confronting its darkest truths. They tried to bury her, but they didn't know she was aflame. Lorelei's location was revealed quietly. through a trusted social worker who had arranged her placement with a compassionate foster family outside Knoxville, Tennessee. The Smiths, soft-spoken, gentle, and devoted, welcomed Lorelei into their home, treating her not as a burden but as a beloved member of the household. Her days were no longer defined by suspicion or fear. They were shaped by routine, compassion, and safety. She spent mornings in physical therapy sessions, afternoons reading on the porch with Mrs. Smith knitting by her side, and evenings watching the fading sunset paint the mountains in brilliant shades. Here she rediscovered her voice, bit by bit, like a spark catching wind. The day of the court hearing arrived with unexpected calm. Shaq sat in the back row of the courtroom, his frame relaxed but alert. Cornell and Malcolm flanked him quietly, and the gallery behind them was packed with supporters, families, and journalists. Lorelei in her wheelchair was at the witness stand front and center. Gone were the fragile shadows of her former self. She wore a deep blue cardigan over her school uniform, her hair neatly braided, her posture upright. She looked at each person in the room with steady eyes, delivering her words with crystal clarity. The questioning began gently. Recount the first time she met Cutter, or when she realized something was wrong. Each answer came measured and firm. When asked whether she felt unsafe, she paused only briefly before stating, "Yes, but I learned that silence can kill, and I won't let that happen to me again." The courtroom seemed to inhale that moment. Her bravery wasn't performative. It was elemental. Observers felt it ripple through them, awakening a hard, empathetic ache. Cross-examination brought more challenges. Cutter's lawyer suggested emotional manipulation and leading guidance from Shaq. Lorelei met each suggestion with a calm rebuke. "I spoke with Mr. O'Neill about what I witnessed, not the other way around." She described how she made the decision to come forward only when she felt she could stand on her own dignity, not because someone offered protection but because she chose to fight. When she told the story of secret meetings, the deletion of equipment from schools, and the hush of budget meetings where children like her became expendable costs, her voice barely wavered. The tears that slid down her cheeks at one moment were genuine, raw expressions of the hurt she carried. And yet as her testimony ended, she straightened and looked at the judge. "I'm more than a number. I'm more than a budget line. I am a child, and I deserve to be seen." The judge paused, rifling through notes. The courtroom was still. Then, finally, he spoke. "Based on the testimony presented, the overwhelming weight of the evidence, and the moral obligation this court holds, I rule in favor of Ms. Lorelei Williams. Her rights were violated. The respondents will be held accountable, and reparative steps must begin immediately." A gasp traveled through the room, followed by a swelling wave of applause, the kind that speaks less of victory and more of relief. Shaq, seated behind Cornell and Malcolm, released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His eyes glistened as he watched Lorelei's foster parents rush forward to embrace her. For the first time in years, she smiled, no longer a half-guarded posture, but a radiant release of glowing relief. The judge's ruling wasn't symbolic. Within weeks, the state legislature introduced a bill requiring transparent tracking of school enrollment, mandatory reporting of equipment transfers, and a ban on budget reallocations without parental or guardian approval. A statewide task force was assembled, led by disability advocacy groups alongside lawmakers. Cutter faced criminal charges. Branford resigned in disgrace, pledging to cooperate. Wexler's guardianship credentials were revoked, and she was investigated for elder abuse and misrepresentation. Several other individuals faced charges under negligence statutes. The media spotlight intensified. Lorelei appeared on the evening news, her voice strong as she reiterated the words that had ignited change. Newspapers ran editorials titled "Invisible No More" and "The Cost of Compassion." National outlets praised Shaq, but more importantly, they celebrated Lorelei's strength. Memorial statues and scholarships were proposed in Atlanta and Knoxville in her honor, focused on accessible education for disabled children of color. Shaq didn't seek the spotlight. He spoke when invited, deflecting praise to Lorelei and the families who came forward. He attended school board meetings and helped shape the new policies. He visited schools to test wheelchair ramps himself, ensuring the work was done correctly and compassionately. Every time he did, he remembered Lorelei's words and her unbreakable commitment. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, a press conference was held in Atlanta. Lorelei wheeled herself to the podium, next to state legislators and disability rights leaders. She introduced the Lorelei Williams Accessibility Act, a sweeping package of reforms for public schools in Georgia, universal accommodations reviews, student advocacy liaisons in every district, and clear penalties for non-compliance. When the governor signed the bill into law, Lorelei smiled gently at Shaq in the front row. He nodded, proud but humbled. The day he visited the newly passed law's first pilot school, he spotted Jada waiting in the courtyard. Lorelei wheeled up beside her and presented the first student-accessible bench installed under the new act. For every girl who believed she didn't have a place, Jada said. They both turned to Shaq, who smiled back, voice quiet. You all had the place, you just had to claim it. And claim it they did. Lorelei's spark became the fire that lit an entire movement. In fulfilling the promise of hope, she taught a city and a nation that when the unseen and unheard rise, they don't just fight darkness, they change the world. He never wanted a legacy, just a little more sunlight for others. Years later, a soft breeze stirred through the windows of Lorelei's house. The community center Shaq helped build in a quiet Atlanta neighborhood. It was more than a building. It was a testament to survival, to resilience, and to sunlight gathered through broken clouds. On the front lawn, wheelchairs and walkers lined up like friendly guardians, waiting for the laughter and foot traffic that would breathe life into the place each morning. Shaq walked through the front doors just as a Sunday session began. He didn't enter with flash or fanfare. No entourage, no security detail, just one giant man in a sweater and slacks, carrying a thermos of coffee. He paused at the threshold, inhaling the warmth, children giggling as they worked on painting wheels, parents chatting quietly in the lounge, volunteers adjusting therapy tools with gentle attentiveness. He wasn't here as Big Shaq, the basketball legend. He was here as Shaq, a family member, a mentor, a human whose shoulders carried less weight, and whose smile carried more calm. He greeted the receptionist, who leaned forward with a wave, and walked down the hall past rooms labeled art therapy and accessible robotics. In each space he saw small beacons of potential, tiny hands gripping crayons, wheels turning with intent, the quiet hum of adaptive computers. Then he arrived at Lorelei's office. The door was open, and inside stood Lorelei, now a social worker in her mid-20s, with braces on her wrists, and a gentle confidence in her posture. Her hair was still intricately braided, but her eyes shone differently, not with fear, but with purpose. She spotted him and broke into a grin that held both warmth and depth. "Morning," she said softly, stepping out to greet him. Her wheelchair glided beside him, as she offered her hand. He took it and squeezed gently. "How are you today, Shaq?" she asked, voice steady as she handed him a cup of cocoa she'd made. "Better now," he replied, his tone low and grateful. They walked together into the center's main courtyard, where children were practicing balance on ramps and using lifts. A small activity circle formed as he approached. A boy named Trevor grinned and called out, "Coach." Shaq smiled and shook his head. "Organization drill. What should we do today?" Trevor planted his hands on the wheels, then rolled forward with flourish. "A race, coach." Another child laughed in applause. Shaq joined the circle and pretended to check his clipboard. "You have 10 seconds to tell me what inclusion means," he said in mock seriousness. The kids shouted definitions: fairness, accessibility, kindness. Shaq nodded, acting impressed. But he knew this day was special because the center stood on ground, once marred by neglect. Here, money flowed into teaching therapists, funding counseling sessions, and installing high-tech accessibility tools, made possible by the accessibility legislation Lorelei had helped pass. The smiles on the children's faces weren't the legacy of star power. They were the living result of hope, planted and tended. They finished the session and walked back into the courtyard. Lorelei paused by a stone fountain with a plaque engraved, "For the children who find light in darkness, may you always shine." Every Sunday, she said, her voice reflective, "I see someone new, someone happier than yesterday. That plaque, it wasn't for us. It's for them." Shaq looked down at the fountain and its gentle churn of water. "Your light became their sunlight." They took a seat at a nearby bench. A volunteer brought by a fresh thermos of herbal tea. Shaq nodded thanks. They sat quietly, watching families arrive. A teenage girl in a manual wheelchair zipped by with reckless joy, her mother chasing behind, laughing. A small boy leaned onto a ramp with both hands, whispering encouragement to himself before rolling down. The air was filled with the sound of belonging. Lorelei turned toward Shaq. "Do you ever miss the noise? The stadium, crowds, the world at your feet?" He paused. "Sometimes." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small smooth stone he'd picked up at the groundbreaking years ago. But this, he squeezed gently, this isn't emptiness anymore. It's purpose. Her eyes glistened. She nodded. You gave me sunshine, Shaq. You showed me I mattered. Now I get to do that for everyone else. They paused, letting the sentiment linger. Neither needed more words. Later, as the morning session closed, and families prepared to leave, Shaq stood at the entrance, greeting people on their way out. Parents hugged their children. Volunteers said thank you. Staff waved. A girl squeezed past his legs to show him her painted wheelchair wheel, adorned with rainbow stripes. Shaq knelt, examined it carefully. Beautiful. You chose the colors? She nodded. Shy smile. Yes. For hope. Shaq looked up and against every expectation of legend or celebrity simply said, keep shining. He stood, watched her roll away, then turned toward Lorelei, who stood beside him. A moment later they walked to the center's garden, a space behind the building where herbal plants, vegetables, sensory flowers, and shaded seating had been planted collaboratively with the kids. Each plant had a story: lavender for calm, mint for clarity, sunflowers for resilience. Lorelei knelt and touched the soil with reverence. They grow just like people, she said. Given sunlight, water, and care. He kneeled beside her and placed his massive hand over hers on the soil. We gave them sunlight. They stayed there for a while, the helper and the helped rooted together in quiet triumph. When they rose to leave, Shaq paused at the garden's edge and looked back at the center. He finally allowed himself to feel legacy, not the kind with trophies or jerseys in glass cases, but the kind that lived and breathed in completed activities, in confident smiles, in children's laughter. Walking back to his car, he glanced at Lorelei. She smiled. He smiled back. No need for speeches. No need for crowds. Just two people. Once saved, now growing a garden for others. One act, planting ramp, letter protest, reform had indeed saved them both, and a town had learned to bloom in the sunlight they cultivated together. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes, stirred your heart, or made you believe in the quiet power of standing up for what's right, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel for more powerful real-world inspired stories that give voice to the unheard and shine light on what matters. Like this video, if you believe every child deserves to be seen. Share it with someone who needs to remember that even in silence, there is strength, and sometimes one act really can change everything.